I felt it only appropriate that we come to you with a special edition of Notsam Wrestling. I was thinking about incorporating this into the regular podcast, but it really does deserve its own show. As we speak, and I record this on the day of what is being advertised as Sting's last match, his retirement match at AEW Revolution, as he teams with Darby Allin to take on the Young Bucks. A lot of us, myself included, are thinking about the career of Sting. This does not feel like a wrestling retirement. This feels like a retirement. This feels like Shawn Michaels' last match. To an extent, it feels like Ric Flair's last match, but I guess maybe we knew that Ric Flair wasn't ever going to go. But maybe that's because Ric Flair and Sting's careers are so cosmically linked. I think when I realized that I needed to do this show, it was when I was watching Dynamite on Wednesday, when I saw Sting rappel from the ceiling, as I had watched him do so many times in the late 90s, watching Nitro every week, flipping channels back and forth between Monday Night Raw and WCW Nitro. And as a kid, I was a WWE loyalist. But Sting rappelling from the ceiling was one of those things that no matter what, made me change the channel. No matter how big of a WWE fan I was, if there was a Sting segment on TV during that era, I was watching. And it got me to thinking, what is it about Sting? What is it about Sting that is so very special? What is it about Sting that makes us, throughout the eras and generations upon generations of fans, relate to this character? Because it's not like we just relate to one version of Sting. From 1985 until 2024, nearly 30 years, you've got different versions of Sting. And I would say from 1990 on, you've got people that would tell you that version of Sting is my favorite wrestler that's ever existed. And I think one of the really fascinating things about Sting is that for all intents and purposes, he is a sports entertainment wrestling character. Meaning, in the NWA, in the territory era, it felt like you had your WWE, which was the Hulk Hogan, Ultimate Warrior, larger-than-life sports entertainment. And then you had your NWA, which is your more reality-based, your Ric Flairs, your Arn Andersons, your Dusty Rhodes, your Harley Races, Terry Funks, people like that. And Sting comes along and really modernizes the NWA in a way. But it's also one of the few larger-than-life cartoon character come into reality, superhero type wrestling characters that not only was it not created by the WWE, but really has no WWE on it at all, except for that one set of 2 matches, which doesn't really add to the lore of Sting. And the lore of Sting is it starts in the mid 80s. This is a guy who didn't necessarily grow up a wrestling fan, but was an athlete, was a bodybuilder, and ended up finding his way into the world of professional wrestling. And very early on into his career, I believe his first wrestling name was Flash before he was Sting. But at the very beginning of his career, going back to about 1985, he started using the name Sting in, I believe, the UWF, the Universal Wrestling Federation, while he was teaming with a guy named Jim Hellwig. And Steve Borden and Jim Hellwig became the Blade Runners. Sting of the Blade Runners. And even back then, it was face paint. Right away, it was the bleach blonde, crew cut, spiked hair. It looked different. And the physiques on both of those guys, they were young, they were big, they were strong, they were charismatic, they were fast. It was something to behold. But everybody knew it was something to behold. Very early on, 1986, I believe, 1987, Jim Hellwig ends up leaving the Blade Runners and goes over to the WWE, where he becomes the Ultimate Warrior. So now Sting of the Blade Runners, and again, this is another thing that makes Sting so unique, is that he took a path the exact opposite of the Ultimate Warrior. And generally speaking, when a tag team exists very early on, and one of those team members ends up becoming the Ultimate Warrior, the other team member becomes, oh yeah, and then there was that guy too. Not in this case. Sting is looked at as somebody who's potentially very valuable to the UWF, and they start to sort of build him as what could be a top babyface. They put him in television title contention. They have him pretty quickly allying up, teaming up with the Steiner brothers, who are a big over tag team at that point. And pretty quickly, the UWF is bought out by Jim Crockett. Now, this is key. In a lot of scenarios, for a lot of superstars, this would be death, right? A lot of times when new management comes in, the talent that was being looked at as the future of the company is swept away, and whatever vision the new management has, those are the guys that are going to be the new big stars. Except Jim Crockett and Dusty Rhodes, who was booking at the time, both saw this huge upside, this huge star potential in Sting. And not only as they were incorporating the UWF stars into what they were doing with Crockett Promotions and the NWA, not only did they keep Sting, but that was the around the same time that they put him in the main event of the first Clash of the Champions. And that first Clash of the Champions is really looked at as the beginning of Sting being looked at as that top babyface. But it's also Crockett Promotions bringing in a new generation, because Sting, not only was he somebody who hadn't been in that main event scene before, but he also wasn't like anybody that had been in the main event scene before. He was the new era. He was what the 90s wrestling would look like. And he was the type of personality that you were going to have on the screen that was going to bring kids in, that they were going to want to paint their faces like him, that they were going to be attracted to all the bright colors, that he had new gear every single week, and the scorpion on the side of his tights, and the matching boots to the bold and bright colors on his tights and his face paint. It was an experience with Sting, including the jacket with the tassels coming down and everything, or the robe. It was a constant evolution. But we saw Sting and Ric Flair go to a time limit draw, which was huge for a guy like Sting, because while he didn't win the world title at that point, he wasn't anywhere near being ready to be the world champion in the NWA with Ric Flair there. But he went to a time limit draw. He took Ric Flair to the limit. And the perception on Sting after that was completely different. You know, the match was great, but he was now in this championship category. And he sort of started to be looked at, even from people who, maybe you were a WWE fan like I was, but you'd get the magazines and you'd see Sting. Even if you weren't watching the NWA, you'd see Sting. And you'd see this person who was like, almost like a Hogan Warrior hybrid. Like, it was similar, yet completely different to what we were seeing on television. But the minute you saw a photo, that's how you knew you were onto something. The minute you saw a photo, you were like, I got to find out more about this guy. He had the charisma. He had everything. So eventually, Crockett ends up selling their promotion to Ted Turner. And Ted Turner makes it into WCW. And lucky for Sting, Ted Turner saw what everybody else saw, what the Crockett's saw, what the audiences saw. He saw Sting as a potential top talent. We saw Sting have runs with the United States Championship, the Television Championship. We saw him go to another time limit draw with Ric Flair. This time, I believe it was a full 60 minutes. And eventually, we get to 1990. We'd have Sting had that, of course, notorious angle with RoboCop. Everybody brings up the RoboCop angle. But what that does show you is WCW was trying hard to pierce the mainstream, to do more of what WWE was doing and get those celebrities involved. And maybe they couldn't get Cyndi Lauper, but RoboCop was available. But who did they pair RoboCop with? Who did they want audiences who didn't watch the product to know about? It was Sting. They wanted that face paint, that hair, that everything, that charisma to be on the screen. They did an angle where Sting became a horseman for a short period of time. Sting is on that list of people who were members of the Four Horsemen. which of course blew up in his face and led to a match against Ric Flair that Sting finally won, winning the World's Heavyweight Championship in 1990. Sting would follow that up with rivalries with, of course, Ric Flair, Sid Vicious, Lex Luger, the Dangerous Alliance. He would go and WCW would branch off from the NWA. So the NWA title, or the lineage of it, would kind of be warped. And the big gold belt became WCW's international title. And their world title became the WCW Championship, which Sting also had runs with. And one of these runs with the title led to maybe my favorite WCW rivalry pre-NWO that Sting had, which was with Vader. The idea of the babyface fighting from beneath against the monster is a tale as old as time. You could argue that that's what Cody Rhodes has with Roman Reigns right now to an extent. Roman Reigns may not be this big hulking monster the way Vader was, but what he's done is monstrous. The way he's a beast that cannot be conquered. And this is who Vader was. Vader was coming off fresh from Japan. Peak American Vader. And this was who Sting had to deal with, and he couldn't deal with it. Vader would squash him. Vader would powerbomb him. Vader broke his ribs. And it built and built and built until finally Sting could be the hero that would finally conquer Vader. And you really bought into it. You bought into every bit of Vader being this unconquerable foe. I loved Vader from that perspective. But Sting was the only guy that could beat him. And when Sting finally did beat Vader, it really added to that aura of Sting as the hero. He got into some murky waters there in WCW for a period of time because Eric Bischoff took over, and there was this kick into gear for WCW to really start competing with WWE. That in WCW did not want to be looked at as a distant second. They wanted to be looked at as putting on a product that was of the standards of WWE. So how are they going to do that? Bring in the star power that WWE had. So what WCW started doing is signing big names from WWE to come in. People like Hulk Hogan. People like Macho Man Randy Savage. And while that's all great and a sound strategy, it led to a giant pay-per-view buy rate, especially by WCW standards, the first pay-per-view that Hulk Hogan came in for, and he main evented against Ric Flair. We finally saw the Hogan versus Flair match. But what happens to the guy that's been the face of your company for all these years? What happens to the guy that's been waving the flag? What happens to the guy that was built as an alternative to Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage when you actually bring in Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage? Sting found himself, while still looked at as a giant star, in more of a support role. And at the same time all this was going on, times were changing. So while Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage were kind of pushed to be the top guys in the company, the things that Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage had done previously no longer connected with the audience in the same way. Wrestling audiences were looking for something different. And Sting was in that same boat. Sting was built to be the alternative to Hulk Hogan and Randy Savage and people like that. But ultimately, as I said earlier, was a very similar sports entertainment, late 80s, early 90s character. And so Sting found himself in this position where not only is he no longer the top guy, but also his gimmick wasn't connecting with the audiences the way it used to. So you started to see little changes, right? Sting started becoming a little less of a character, and you started to see more of the real person. He let his natural hair grow in, right? He still would come to the ring with the neon green tights and the bright face paint, but instead of bleach blonde hair, which was so popular in the early 90s, he started letting it grow in naturally. He would let his brown hair grow in and be a little wavy and everything. He was part of the 1996 Bash at the Beach match, where the NWO came in, and then it was just the Outsiders with their mystery third man to take on Lex Luger, Randy Savage, and Sting. And of course, they all wore the Sting face paint going into that match, which does give some credence to the fact that Sting is still that top guy. And when the Outsiders came in, it did give Sting kind of an immediate kick into gear. Because when the Outsiders came in, it did change wrestling forever. And any inkling that fans had that they were kind of over the cartoon character era of wrestling was solidified when Kevin Nash and Scott Hall walked in their street clothes, using their real names, speaking in their real voices, and really speaking to that audience that was craving something different and, quite frankly, ready for WCW to be taken over by a rebellious force. That said, they were villains. And who is the guy? If somebody is coming in to take out WCW, who do you look at as your top guy to represent everything that WCW is? Who do you look at, no matter where the wave is going, no matter what's cool and what's not cool? Who should be the guy logically that would be on the front lines defending WCW? Sting. So whether we realized it or not, immediately when the Outsiders came in, it gave Sting a reason for being. If you wanted to have the NWO booed, Sting was the quintessential good guy to have them face off with. And so this storyline started to be told where people started going over to the NWO. Hulk Hogan went over to the NWO. The Giant went over to the NWO. And they started saying Sting is coming over. Sting is here. Sting is a member of the NWO. Sting said, I'm not a member of the NWO. The NWO said, oh, yes, you are. Sting is a member. And it went all the way to War Games, where Sting was on the side of the NWO until Sting came out. Yes, a fake Sting had been used. It had been a ruse the whole time. That they had a body double, a wrestler who used to go by the name of the Cobra, was now the Scorpion. He had been dressed as Sting. And WCW had no faith. WCW and the superstars of WCW had just assumed that was the real Sting, and Sting had been lying to them. Well, it didn't really sit too well with Sting. And he went on Nitro the next night, and he said he was done, that he was not a member of the NWO. He never would be a member of the NWO, but WCW didn't have his back, and it became difficult for him to have WCW's back if they weren't going to have his. And he said the immortal words that would become, I think, probably the most important phrase in Sting's career. This is something that he said multiple times since. The only thing that's for sure about Sting is nothing's for sure. And he walked out. And it was, for all intents and purposes, the last time that we saw that version of Sting, because he went away for a couple of weeks, and then suddenly on an episode of Nitro, they panned to the top of the rafters, and we saw Sting dressed in all black and white with makeup on that resembled Brandon Lee's character in The Crow, which had been a popular movie like 3 years before, but the imagery of that movie is, I mean, to this day it's popular, but it was super popular then. And we see him just up in the rafters, all black, white paint, black eye makeup on, expressionless, just watching. And we don't know what any of it means. And we saw this evolve. We saw the look evolve. We saw the paint evolve. The hair would grow longer. We'd start to see a scorpion on his chest, just a white scorpion on a black t-shirt. At some points, he would have a literal crow. And he'd just watch. And he'd be looming over WCW. And then he would come to the ring, first through the crowd, and then he'd start rappelling down from the ceiling. And he would rappel down from the ceiling, and he would have a black baseball bat with him. And he would give that baseball bat to the superstars of WCW, and he would turn their back on him. He would turn his back on them to see if they would hit him. And they didn't. And he'd disappear once more. And over the course of time, he started to develop a rivalry with the NWO after months and months and months. When the NWO was using the numbers advantage to take out WCW superstars, Sting would rappel down from the ceiling, out of the blue, and take out the entire NWO with that baseball bat. He was the one thing, as the NWO had this reign of terror over WCW, Sting was the one superstar who was able to defend WCW. Sting was the one superstar on his own that was able to fight off the NWO. And while Hollywood Hogan had other opponents and the NWO had other rivalries, he was always there looming. And this thing built and built and built and built. And it went from coming right off of Fall Brawl 96 all the way to Starrcade 97, a year into this story. J.J. Dillon started to feel the pressure. The on-screen authority figure of WCW started to feel the pressure that Sting wanted a match with Hogan. That's what he wanted. He was ready to declare his side. Sting did not wrestle for 15 months. Yet for 15 months, we all tuned into Nitro to see what Sting was going to do. He didn't wrestle, and he didn't say a word. He didn't fight or talk. And he was the biggest star on that show. The spring break episodes of Nitro, where they would do the show outside, and the helicopter would fly above the ring, and Sting would come down from the helicopter. It was amazing stuff. Sting coming down from the ceiling with that trench coat on, holding his baseball bat, was as iconic an image as you could ever get. And even the most ardent fans of Monday Night Raw and WWE would still say, but Sting's cool. And Halloween would come around, and people would be dressed up as The Rock, and they'd be dressed up as Mankind, they'd be dressed up as Stone Cold, and they'd be dressed up as Sting. You couldn't go anywhere. 97, 98, even into 99, without people dressed up, kids dressed up as Crow-era Sting. It brought us all the way to Starrcade 97, which was maybe the best build to a single match, potentially in the history of wrestling. You can talk about stories all you want, but when you talk about builds to a single match, you can go back to WrestleMania 3 and Hogan and Andre. That had an incredible build. You know, you could argue Cody and Roman, but I feel like those are both bigger stories that weren't necessarily just directed into this one build. Undertaker and Kane, but again, a bigger story, not necessarily about a single match. It was all about this moment. It was almost like this entire reign of terror that the NWO had squashing WCW for 15 months was all a build to what we were going to see with Sting and Hollywood Hogan. And somehow, without fighting, without wrestling, without saying a word, Sting had slowly, over the course of 15 months, built anticipation and built anticipation and built anticipation until you got to Starrcade 97. And every wrestling fan in the world was glued to it. The best build to a single match, maybe in the history of wrestling, with the worst payoff, maybe, in the history of wrestling. And one of the reasons why the payoff is so bad is because the buildup was so good. Of course, you get what should have been a fast count. It was a completely standard count by Nick Patrick. Hogan wins fair and square. Bret Hart comes in and says the referee screwed Sting. The fans go, he didn't really. Sting ends up winning the title. You have your moment of Sting holding up the title triumphantly, having beaten Hollywood Hogan. But the air has been completely taken out of the building. I mean, you're watching, not even the building, just watching at home. You're like, what? I guess. Did he? The next night on Nitro, they go, okay, we'll have a rematch. The next night on Nitro. And what happens? They run out of TV time. We don't see the finish. The title ends up being vacated. Sting does eventually end up winning the title without a bunch of weirdness and wonkiness, but by that time, the moment has kind of passed. It's still cool to see Crow Sting. Still cool to see that he's the champion. But they completely just destroyed everything that they were doing at the 1 yard line and then had no plans for what they could do once they got to the end zone. They knew how to get to that 1 yard line And then they had no idea how to finish and no idea how to get any other touchdowns after that. It was remarkable. Sting would still be Sting. He'd still be a top guy. He ended up joining the NWO Wolfpack for some reason, although it was interesting because you did get the red and black instead of white and black look. And it was also during the Wolfpack era that Sting evolved the Crow character further and started to bring back some of that kind of lighthearted charisma and talking. He maintained the Crow look, but brought back some of that charisma. And I mean, I liked it. I liked Wolfpack Sting. It just didn't click the way it had. After Wolfpack Sting, he brought the Crow back. He brought back a little bit of a more serious look. But let's be honest. We're now talking about the last year and a half or so of WCW, and the less that is said about the last year and a half of WCW, the better. But probably the key is, and the great bookmark, this is what you want to do. When you're looking, you want to watch the build of Sting in WCW. You want to see him turn into the Crow. You want to watch that 15-month beautiful build to Starrcade 97. And then before you get to the end of Starrcade 97, maybe just fast forward a couple of clips of him in the Wolfpack and then watch the last episode of Nitro. Because the last episode of Nitro was like poetry. At the first Clash of Champions, Sting made his mark by going to a time limit draw with Ric Flair. They celebrated that on the first episode of Nitro by doing Sting versus Ric Flair. And on the last night that WCW as we knew it was in business, the last episode of WCW Monday Nitro, the main event that night was once again Ric Flair versus Sting. And it couldn't have been more fitting for where we were at the time. And I'm personally so glad that that was the final match of WCW as we knew it. When WWE acquired WCW, a lot of the WCW talent obviously went over to WWE, but a lot of the big names did not because they had guaranteed contracts with Turner, so they just they collected their checks. However, eventually, they all made their way over. Eventually, Hogan made it. Eventually, Hall and Nash made it. Eventually, Goldberg made it. Eventually, DDP made it quicker. Booker T made it a little quicker. Sting didn't. Sting decided not to. Sting sat at home and collected his money, and then Sting watched what was going on with some of the WCW superstars in WWE and said, yeah, I don't know if I want to do that. I don't know, going back to what we said in the beginning of this, if Sting, which very well may be the best sports entertainment character. It's not Ric Flair, it's not Dusty Rhodes. I'm just talking about like a sports entertainment character, entity. The best cartoon character come to life. Never created by WWE. What does that look like in WWE? At the time, there were thoughts that the people in charge of WWE in 2001 did not like things that they didn't create. And Sting didn't want to risk that. So instead, he signed what at the time was a short-term deal with TNA in 2003. And people figured it was just like, okay, Sting will go in, work with Jeff Jarrett a little bit. He had been working with him in WCW, make a little bit of money, do some one-off appearances, and it'll be great. Nobody realized when Sting got to TNA in 2003, number one, that he would up his deal and become a full-time member of the roster for years. But number two, do some of the best work in his career. And while one generation found him after Clash of the Champions as the face of WCW, and another generation found him when he donned the Crow makeup as the great nemesis of the New World Order, still a third generation would find him for the first time for the work that he did in TNA. He was absolutely phenomenal as a superstar for TNA, to the point that it makes you wonder how much potential was there for him in WWE in that first decade of the 2000s. Because he did some amazing work. He would feud with Jeff Jarrett, with Kurt Angle, Abyss, Christian, Samoa Joe, AJ Styles, and have great matches with them. He would come in as with that kind of crow gimmick that he had, the slightly altered crow gimmick with a little more personality, a little more words to it. And when it started to get to the point in TNA where fans thought, okay, we saw it, like, okay, the sort of cool factor of Sting being here had kind of worn off and said, what else do you have for us? He showed them. And the Main Event Mafia was born. The Main Event Mafia was great. Scott Steiner, Kevin Nash, Booker T, Sting, Kurt Angle. And they showed up, and it was a very real play on politicians in wrestling. It was, okay, if you want to believe that I'm this legend that's just here to leech off the company and make it about myself, okay, let's do that. Let's play that game. Let's lean into that. Let's give you exactly what you want. And the Main Event Mafia was awesome. But what ended up happening was people love Sting too much. So the Main Event Mafia evolved kind of out of it, and that's where some of those rivalries that I was talking about came from. But then he went a step further and did something, and we saw elements of it in AEW, but he evolved his character even further. And I feel like because this happened in TNA, a lot of people don't give it enough credit, but it was a beloved character. A lot of people in that generation loved TNA. You can find people of a certain generation that are like, yep, I grew up on TNA. I used to watch it on Spike. I loved watching Impact. And one of the things that they loved was Joker Sting, where he would take the sort of crow look, but smudge it up a little. He had lost his mind a little bit, and he became this sort of Heath Ledger meets Steve Borden Joker Sting crossover, where maybe Crow Sting didn't realize he wasn't Crow Sting anymore, but fans who were watching did. And it made Joker Sting all the more compelling. I mean, that's where it's like you're getting backstage segments with Sting with his makeup all smudged up, going nuts and going like, yeah, this is great. This is what it's all about. At the end of the TNA run, I think that Sting realized that there was only so much time left in his career, and there were only so many things that he could possibly do left. And I think he started thinking about, if I could put thoughts into his head, what does he want to do? And so he leaves TNA. And the first inkling that we get is the new 2K video game is advertised. And we hear the strings playing. By the way, Sting's WCW theme is incredible. I love it. I love it. And that's being played on the strings, and they turn around and they have their faces painted like Sting. This face paint became so iconic in that era that WCW, who was notoriously terrible at merchandising, they made a boatload of money off of two things. Number one, NWO t-shirts. Number two, Sting masks. They made a boatload of money off those Sting masks. But the string orchestra turns around and they all got Sting paint on, and then Sting shows up, and the announcement is made that in the WWE 2K video game, you're going to be able to play as Sting. And people lose their minds. Now, he makes it very clear, Sting does, that he has not come to WWE to wrestle. He has not come to WWE at all. He has signed a deal that he, as a legend, can be played in 2K. Rumors start to circulate that Mattel has the license, that we're going to get some Sting action figures. But again, this is something where the WWE 2K video games, they have legends in there that are not active wrestlers in the WWE. Mattel puts out action figures of legend. Mattel put a Kevin Von Erich action figure out. When was the last time you saw a Kevin Von Erich WWE match, They put out action figures of legends that WWE has merchandising rights for. That's all that is. Until we get to Survivor Series 2014. At the end of the show, as Triple H is at the height of his reign of terror, I feel like I've said reign of terror several times in this podcast, and I apologize. It's very unoriginal. But as Triple H is just drunk with power, the lights go out, and Sting appears. Sting shows up in a WWE building. This is the one thing at that time that we all thought would never happen, the one thing we all thought we'd never see, the one superstar that would never get to WWE was Sting, yet here he was, Sting, for everybody to see. And he called out Triple H immediately, dropped a Scorpion Death Drop, and took a hike. And we didn't see him again for a couple months. But the challenge was made, and the challenge was accepted, and we found out at WrestleMania 31 we were going to get Triple H versus Sting. Now, this was odd to a few people because we all wanted Sting versus Undertaker. Sting versus Undertaker was always the match that every wrestling fan of that era wanted to see. Crow, Sting, descending from the ceiling, up in the rafters, just morbid as all get up, versus the Dead Man. What could be better than these two icons, these two people that had ascended reality, meeting for the first time in a match that we never thought would happen? Well, for whatever reason, and maybe it was because, keep in mind, this is WrestleMania 31. This is 1 year after Undertaker's streak has been beaten. This is not the same Undertaker. This is not WrestleMania 24, 25, 26, 27, 28. This is 31. We'd see Undertaker and Bray Wyatt on that WrestleMania. This was kind of the Undertaker, and we saw it on that Undertaker documentary. This is just him getting his sea legs back. We do, we can get into the Undertaker's career all we want, but we ended up getting Sting versus Triple H, and it was basically just a nostalgia bath is what it ended up being. And a nostalgia bath that to me, and maybe I'm being too geeky about it didn't make a ton of sense. It was fun seeing all these guys that we grew up watching. But the reality is that DX came out and helped Triple H, which makes sense. And then the NWO came out and helped Sting, with the idea being we're finally seeing DX versus the NWO. Except the NWO was Sting's enemies. Why would the NWO help Sting? It never bothered me. This is what bothered me. Not that it was Triple H versus Sting. Not that we weren't getting Sting versus Undertaker. Not even that Triple H ended up winning the match, which I still don't fully understand. But what bothered me was that the NWO was on Sting's side. Why? It was the original NWO. Hall, Nash, and Hogan? Why would they be on Sting's side? Why would they want him on Sting's side? Why would Sting want them on his side? Made no sense. But at least we got to see Sting, in a good match, by the way, at WrestleMania. Still awesome. Sting would have one more WWE match against the then WWE champion, Seth Rollins. Now, in this match, Sting would get injured, and he would announce that his career was over. In 2016, I believe, he'd end up going in to the WWE Hall of Fame, and he became an ambassador for the WWE. During the pandemic, as Sting's contract was winding down, we're now into 2020, and there were rumors that Sting wanted to do a match with The Undertaker. Kind of like how AJ Styles had gotten to do the Boneyard match with The Undertaker, that we could do a cinematic match, and it didn't happen. And whether that was what it was or whether it was because of other reasons, Sting ended up leaving WWE, which people did not expect. And in December of 2020, Sting showed up in AEW. I think people thought this would be good for AEW. Big star there as an ambassador. Big star there to draw maybe a little bit. Tony Schiavone can go, "It's Sting!" He's on TNT again. That's a fun little thing because that hasn't happened since Nitro. I don't think we realized that we were going to get a full run. I don't think we realized that we were going to get another run where even people that didn't necessarily love what AEW was doing at the time were going to love what Sting was doing. And it happened very slowly. Again, it's the pandemic era. We start with Sting and Darby doing like a cinematic match. Remember that match in the warehouse and everything? And it was cool, and Sting did some really cool stuff, but a cinematic match, smoke and mirrors, we're all good. And slowly but surely, Sting started finding his way to the ring. Sting was involved in when CM Punk returned, and his first match was against Darby Allin. Sting was involved in that. Now, CM Punk being a babyface, we weren't going to get the match, but what we did get was a really cool six-man. MJF and FTR, I believe it was, versus Sting, CM Punk, and Darby Allin, where Sting had the Chicago fists X'd out on his face paint with the colors, and Punk had the Sting paint on. It was a beautiful night, beautiful night. But throughout his AEW run, we'd see Sting doing stuff that defies the imagination, stuff that we would think was impossible. Doing only tag matches, but within these tag matches, doing leaps off the entryway, doing leaps off of spots in the crowd where it's like, I wouldn't see a guy in his 30s doing moves like this, let alone Sting. And he recaptures the imagination. The same way when Sting first started, right after the Clash of the Champions, the whole idea was that Sting was an essence. Sting was a character. Sting was a cartoon character come to life with the paint and the bleach blonde and the neon. It wasn't a human being. It was Sting. It was larger than life. And then you had Crow Sting. That wasn't a human being. That was an essence that would ascend from the ceiling, or descend, that would descend from the ceiling. And then somehow, by himself, take out an entire faction like the NWO. The NWO is capable of completely destroying an entire wrestling company. But this essence that would descend from the ceiling was strong enough that he could fight off an entire group, and we believed it. And then 25 years later, we turn on Dynamite. We turn on Rampage. We turn on an AEW pay-per-view. And we don't see a man in his 60s. We don't see an older wrestler. We see Sting defying logic, doing the impossible. We're lost once again in this world of Sting, where no other man, human being, that's the age in human years of Sting can do the stuff that Sting does. Nobody's jumping off the banister. Nobody's jumping off the entryway. Nobody's telling these stories. Nobody his age is going to make me believe that a guy who's 30 years younger than he is afraid. Nobody who's Sting's age, it's a kiss of death when somebody that old walks to the ring and they look at a guy who's 32 years old and the 32-year-old starts to quiver. That's the end of that 32-year-old's career. That makes no sense. That old man has no business in the ring, except it's not an old man. It's Sting. It goes beyond human interpretation to the point that when Sting looks at the two young bucks, if they are quivering in fear, it makes sense as a fan because it's the essence. It's always been about the essence. It goes beyond, and really the Undertaker is the only character like that, who it's the essence. The human being under the paint has really nothing to do with what we're watching because this essence is created. And that's why we connect the way that we connect. And that's why when in 2024, I'm watching TBS and Sting, for the first time in decades, comes down from the ceiling and the Young Bucks are like, oh my God, we're in such trouble. I'm not thinking to myself, what are you, in trouble because there's an old man on a bungee cord? I'm thinking to myself, damn right you're in trouble. Sting is back. And that's the guy that we say goodbye to. That's the guy who's changed the industry. That's the guy who's the icon. I appreciate you going on this journey with me. Let's all enjoy. Go back. Go on YouTube. Find some Sting matches. Have some fun with them. And we'll see you for another Notsam Wrestling real soon.